Chapter 6, Hades. How are you getting on, book clubbers, members of the Ulysses crew? Shit, do you know what? We've read 100 pages. We've read the first 100 pages of Ulysses. You deserve a medal. But I hope you're enjoying it, and I hope you're getting something out of it. I am loving reading it for the second time. So yeah, and I'm hoping that these videos are kind of helping steer your way through. So this chapter is called Hades, right? And it's all about death and the dead, as you might expect from a chapter with that title. And in it, we're back with Leopold Bloom. Well, I say back, we're still with him. We've never really left him, have we? We've been with him for the last few chapters. And here Bloom gets in a carriage with the men that he knows in Dublin, and they travel to Dignam's funeral. And we see him in the carriage and the chatter and the conversation that goes on in that carriage. And we listen to his thoughts, what he's thinking in the carriage, and then we go to the church where they have the funeral for Dignam, and then we see Dignam buried in the churchyard. And during the chapter, we learn quite a lot about Bloom. And so I just thought I'd mention the things that I thought that we discover from the chapter to see if you picked up on them. Well, one thing as well, it's probably worth pointing out, when I read Ulysses for the first time, when I read this chapter for the first time, I actually thought that Daedalus was Stephen Daedalus, the younger, who we met in chapters 1 and 2. But it's not. It's actually his dad. It's Daedalus Senior. So we know that Bloom is actually friends with Stephen's dad, or acquaintances. I wouldn't maybe say friends, but, sort of acquaintances with Stephen's dad. And they're in the carriage together, a few of these men travelling to the funeral. And weirdly, we pass Stephen Daedalus on the street. The carriage passes it, and actually the gentlemen see Stephen and point to him out the window, and they're like, "Oh, it's your son." He said, "Who's that? Your son and heir." "Where is he?" Mr. Daedalus says, stretching over across. So his dad's obviously quite eager to see him. And the carriage passes over the open drains and mounds of ripped up roadway before the tenement houses lurched round the corner, and swerving back to the tram track, rolled on noisily with chattering wheels. Mr. Daedalus fell back, saying, "Was that Mulligan cad with him?" And we learn from this that Stephen Daedalus, his dad, does not like the people that Stephen seems to be hanging out with. I don't know whether this was something that Joyce experienced himself, that his parents didn't like who he was hanging out with. But he goes on to say, "He's in with a low-down crowd," Mr. Daedalus snarled. "That Mulligan is a contaminated-bodied, double-dyed ruffian, by all accounts. His name stinks all over Dublin." So obviously, Stephen's dad doesn't approve of him hanging about with Mulligan. So that's quite an interesting thing that you learn. And obviously, Stephen's quite estranged from his father then, because obviously if his father doesn't approve of who he knocks about with. And then we learn a few other things about Bloom. Actually, we learn about that he's lost his son, because they're in the funeral carriage, and they're talking about Stephen being Daedalus' senior son, and it just makes Bloom think, "Oh, son, what would it be like to have a son?" And then he says, and we learn the name, if little Rudy had lived, so obviously Bloom's son was called Rudy, if little Rudy had lived, see him grow up, hear his voice in the house, walking beside Molly in an Eton suit, my son, me in his eyes, strange feeling it would be from me, just a chance. And then he recalls the moment that his son was conceived, which is again just a thought process thing. Must have been that morning in Raymond Terrace. She was at the window, watching the two dogs at it by the wall of the Cease to Do Evil, and the sergeant grinning up. She had that cream gown on with the rip she never stitched. Give us a touch, Poldy. God, I'm dying for it. How life begins. And I love that about James Joyce, about the way the magnificence of the universe and the hugeness of human creation is brought about so humbly. I don't know whether I've expressed myself right there, but I'm hoping you get what I mean, like the big just happening in the everyday, you know, and the lovely eggs, often we feel that we're drawn to that, like the magnificence of normal life, the magnificence of the mundane, and the massiveness of the universe condensed into just such ordinary things is something that's really fascinates me. Anyway, moving on, apart from the fact that we learned that Bloom loses his son, we also learned that his dad committed suicide, because they're all talking about death in the carriage, and one of the things he says, oh, what's the worst way to go, you know, and one of the things that Daedalus Senior says is, oh, suicide would be awful. And just as they're walking into church, one of the party pulls Daedalus aside and says, it's Martin Cunningham, who's obviously one of the funeral party. Martin Cunningham whispered, I was in mortal agony with you talking of suicide before Bloom. What? Mr. Power whispered. How so? His father poisoned himself, Martin Cunningham whispered. Had the Queen's Hotel in Ennis. You heard him say he was going to, Claire. Anniversary. Oh God, Mr. Power whispered. First I'd heard of it. Poisoned himself. So obviously, you know, Bloom's dad has committed suicide. That's a shock to Power, who learns about it. But it's also, Stephen, I feel like when you read this book in the carriage, Bloom's always the outsider. He's always trying to ingratiate himself with the rest of the party, like try and tell funny stories, but he's always interrupted. And the very fact that one of his family members, his dad, has committed suicide kind of sets him apart from the others, you know, like an outsider. And I think we get this theme of Bloom being the outsider. And I think, you know, there's talk about whether Bloom's Jewish or not, whether he's got Jewish ancestry, but that's certainly part of it. But I think we learned that maybe later on it's brought out more in the book, but it's this idea of Bloom being a real outsider among these sort of normal gentlemen of Dublin. So we learned that. I think this chapter is a brilliant, in the carriage, some brilliant scenes of clattering about Dublin. It's amazing. I love it when it gets to the point when they basically, the carriage, you know, gets stuck in the middle of a drove of cattle. And they're all like, bloody hell, why is there cattle here? Can't they find a different way to get cattle in and out of Dublin? And just the idea, you can almost smell it and like hear it. Like, I don't know, but his writing is so vivid to me that you're almost there on the streets of Dublin, seeing like the carriage and the busyness of it and the droves of cattle. Yeah, it's good for description really of the streets of Dublin. We also learn a little bit more about Molly through his thoughts. We meet Boylan. They see another person out the window of the carriage, which is Boylan. Now Boylan, because I mentioned before that Molly is like a singer, Boylan is her agent, and Bloom is literally paranoid that she's having an affair with Boylan. And we'll see later in the chapter if this comes to fruition. Not in the chapter, sorry, in the book. We'll see if it comes to anything, but we know that at the moment Bloom is paranoid that Molly's having an affair with him. There's also tittle tattle, you know, during the carriage ride, and they talk about an event that happened some time prior when one of the carriages overturned and a coffin spilled out and there was a corpse on the road. So there's all that. I mean, there's so much to unpack in this chapter, and I just don't want these videos to go on for, you know, ages, because it's boring. I mean, I could talk more and more about everything that happens, but I don't want to. One thing I did think though was in the church, it was pretty funny, was Joyce's style and his, I think, possible criticism of the church or playfulness with the ridiculousness of church pomp and ceremony. Was his description of the funeral service through the eyes of Bloom, and he just described it as the priest took a stick with a knob at the end of it out of the boy's bucket and shook it over the coffin. And just by describing these ceremonial rituals in such a basic way, kind of mocks them really. And so I thought that was quite an interesting observation, well, to me anyway, about what maybe Joyce thought about all the sort of tradition and the ceremonies that take place in the Catholic Church. We also learn a bit about what Bloom does for a living. It was quoted as being a traveller for blotting paper, but that was one of his associates trying to have a dig at him really. But he basically secures adverts, I think, for newspapers and puts them in. So he's an advertising representative. But you can tell what his associates think of him really, because they're all discussing it. They say, oh, Molly, couldn't she have done better than him? Like, he's only a traveller for blotting paper. So Bloom isn't particularly well thought of, I don't think. I thought this chapter was great, really good just for picking up on developing the character of Bloom, not just himself, but how he fits in his life with other people in Dublin. We've got to keep reading this book. Let me know what you think about it. Like, there's so much more to unpack in this chapter, which was pretty long to be fair. Please let me know what you think. And let's have a discussion about some of the stuff in there. It's really good. Right, onward. Keep going. This is going to be good.